I thought I could just give you a brief outline of what I'm going to discuss today, where I'll briefly introduce the work that JPAL South Asia does, delve into the immunization issue a little bit, really to understand what the barriers are, before we sort of talk about the solutions, and where I promise to share some insights from our ongoing research on closing the immunization gap. I will also then talk a little bit about the role of digital health systems, um, and how that can play a role in deploying these interventions in the future. I've also planned to keep a little bit of time for Q&A, so I think you're advised to put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and I'll promise to try and get to them at the very end. So just to briefly introduce the organization I belong to, so JPAL South Asia is an organization whose mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. And essentially what we do is translate research into action. We do this through our work on the research front, where we identify unsolved problems, constraints and policy priorities, and fund new cutting edge research on these questions. Across the sectors that we work in, we have policy experts on how to adapt these research findings and distill them for audiences, including government stakeholders, NGOs, foundations, and others looking to make their programs more effective. And as an extension of the work that we do, and in order to really make this the research that we do more effective and more impactful, we also run capacity building sessions where we undertake either online education or executive trainings to help our various stakeholders really understand how to conduct randomized evaluations or use the insights that are generated from the work that we do. A quick sort of history lesson that JPAL started at MIT, in 2003, and is now a network of more than 200 affiliated researchers based in leading universities around the world, and they really anchor the research that JPAL undertakes, which is based across various regions around the world. I'll talk a little bit about JPAL South Asia, which is headquartered in Chennai and hosted by the Institute of Financial Management and Research. But we also have a policy team that's based in New Delhi, which is the team that I belong to and where I'm based. We also have project offices around the country and over 1,000 field staff, typically at any given point of time, undertaking the research that we do. We also have several partnerships with stakeholders, including governments, the central and state governments, such as the government of Punjab, Odisha, and Tamil Nadu, partnerships with academic institutions, and also civil society organizations. I briefly talked about randomized evaluations at the start, but I want to spend a minute or two just talking about what it means when we say we undertake evaluate programs through randomized evaluations. So this is the methodology that JPAL uses, where before a program starts, before a government is about to launch a program, or an NGO is about to maybe make an innovation to an existing program, all the eligible individuals or units are randomly assigned via lottery or via a coin toss or something that's equally unbiased to two different groups. And essentially what happens is these two groups are statistically identical before the program, and so therefore become a comparable set of groups for us to then assess whether a program is impactful or not. And at the end of an intervention delivery, what we do typically is compare the outcomes between the two groups that have been randomly assigned to either receive a variation of the program, a new program, or the status quo, that's the existing program. So just to recap, this is the sort of process that is undertaken for a randomized evaluation. And as I was saying, what we would typically do is compare the outcomes between the two different groups that have been assigned to either receive the new program or the standard program. And any difference between the two groups, because they are statistically sort of comparable to each other can be attributed to either the program changes that have been made or the new and improved program that's been introduced. So typically in the case of, for instance, immunization, this might be what is the difference between the number of fully immunized children in a set of individuals that got the program and a set of individuals that did not receive any modifications to the program. And we'll come back to this idea of randomized evaluations as we go forward. But I just wanted to provide this brief overview so that it anchors the kind of discussions that we'll be having in going forward. There are many variations in the designs of randomized evaluations, and I'll caveat that this is a very basic definition of the randomized evaluations, but again, it's important for when we go to understanding what the barriers might be. Shirley, if you can confirm that you can see my slide moving.
Yep, we can see it. Yeah.
Thank you. So just to unpack the barriers to immunization and understand what this issue really is all about. Full immunization and achieving this has been a sort of issue across several developing countries, even though it is one of the most cost-effective ways of increasing the benefits to child health and survival, especially in resource-constrained environments. But it does have high returns on investment when you do undertake the immunization interventions. So net returns typically look like 44 times the cost when you take into account the avoided cost of illnesses as well as the economic benefits of living longer and healthier lives. But still in 2017, roughly 20 million children around the world had not been routinely immunized. And around half of these were actually in India, where only 62% of children had actually received the basic set of 5 immunizations that are sort of necessary for these benefits and impacts to be seen on their health and on future economic benefits. And in some states, the worrying trend that we started to notice was that immunization rates were not only low, but were starting to drop. So for instance, in Haryana, where I will talk about some of the research that we did more recently in the state, full vaccination rates actually fell from 65% in 2004, 2005 to 62% across that decade. So in the early part of the 2000s, researchers were wanting to understand what some of the barriers and what some of the potential solutions could look like to really unpack this problem. And this research really anchors where and how the JPAL immunization studies have evolved over time. So just to give you a bit of a background, this study was conducted by affiliates Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo and their team, where they originally studied in rural Udaipur what some of the barriers were to achieving full immunization. So in the district, what was found was that on average the household is 2 kilometers or more from the nearest clinic, but this is exacerbated by the fact that ANNs typically at that point of time really had high absenteeism, and more than roughly half of them were really not even present at the village level health centers on any given workday, with really no predictable pattern as well as to whether they would be coming in or not. And so this was an issue, of course, when parents went to get their children immunized and found that there was nobody at the health facility. This was further exacerbated again by issues of cultural resistance and distrust because of a lack of understanding of the benefits of vaccination, or even suspicions about government health service provisions. And again, I'll caveat that this was over 10 years ago, where some of these issues have been overcome, and I'll talk about the kind of policy efforts that have been made. But one issue that continued to persist was that because there's limited income, parents really couldn't afford to take a day off and continue to chase these these health centers and try and find where and when they could really get their children immunized. And in the district where this research was conducted, full immunization rates were as low as 2%. In the tribal villages in this particular district. So this was a great space to test out potential interventions that could be solutions to both these supply and demand side challenges. So on the supply side, what researchers proposed was making sure that there would be regular immunization camps and monitoring these camps. So they tied up with a local NGO, Seva Mandir, who hired a mobile immunization team to sort of hold these camps on a fixed day of the month and use the and sort of make sure that these camps were well stocked and publicized in the areas as well where they were going to be held, so that caregivers also knew that these camps were going to be um, set up and where they could bring their children for immunizations. And on the demand side, the researchers wanted to use the same immunization camp infrastructure to also see if providing incentives for full immunization would really make a difference. And what they did was provide dal for each immunization that they got, for each shot that their children received, and a thali, which is a sort of a plate for those caregivers who had completed the full immunization. So you got the thali if you completed the entire set, and protected your child completely. Here the big idea, again, researchers wanted to test was to unpack whether relatively small incentives could have a big impact on immunization rates, or whether these immunization rates were low because there was a sort of deeply rooted issue that could not have been impacted by the small incentive. At that point of time, we also had incoming evidence that conditional cash transfers do work to improve immunization rates, but all of that research was set in places where supply was fixed and supply was not an issue. So again, the challenge here was to understand how much of the problem was unreliable supply and how much of it was, just low demand. So what researchers tested was a combination of these incentives. Some caregivers got only access to the immunization camps. Some, received immunization camps and incentives. And there was a comparison group, which is essentially what your randomized evaluation has typically, with varying groups receiving different versions of a particular program. And essentially researchers found that providing the small dal incentives or the lentil incentives for parents was actually sort of quite useful in improving full immunization rates. And when it was combined along with immunization camps, there were the benefits were nearly 6 times more than the comparison group, which is the status quo, that received none of these interventions. But interestingly, what researchers also found was that supply side bottlenecks alone had was a limited barrier in closing these immunization gaps. But adding a small incentive was almost twice as cost effective as addressing access alone. So here the key was that if you were going to be doing the immunization camps, you may as well and if you're going to strengthen supply, you might as well add a small incentive to really make sure that the intervention is both cost effective and really tackling the root of the problem. Nevertheless, policy efforts have focused largely on removing supply side bottlenecks, and this is of course commendable efforts have been made by the Indian government on this front, and it bears taking a step back and zooming out to see across that period of time. Again, this research was conducted in 2005. What efforts have been made, and the government has worked on improving the supply of immunization services here, including making it easier for health workers to access remote villages, designating maybe one specific day of the week for routine immunization, and incentivizing healthcare workers to actually bring the children to immunization sessions. So these have been interventions that have been deployed at scale to improve the supply of immunization, and to make sure that as far as possible, when caregivers go to camps, they do have both ANMs as well as a steady supply of vaccine. However, stimulating demand for full immunization is still a challenge. The supply side efforts have successfully removed certain bottlenecks, but there are still challenges in making sure there's full immunization coverage is high and at the level that we need it to be for it to be effective. I just want to then, sort of switch gears and talk a little bit about the demand side issues and why these seem to persist, consistently over the, last few years. This is the question that the researchers wanted to unpack, because what they were seeing was a trend where you had high rates of initial immunizations, but they tapered off over time. So despite the large investments to increase access, which has clearly strengthened the supply, there are still issues with completing the full schedule of the five basic vaccines that are advised for a child under the age of 1 to complete, which is BCG, Penta 1, Penta 2, Penta 3, and measles. So I want to pause here, have you look at the this slide, because there's clearly room to investigate this further and try and understand why there's this plummeting over the schedule. So I'm going to request the team to maybe launch the Zoom poll at this point, and to understand from you what could be the most likely reasons for dips in immunization. So this could potentially be, researchers hypothesize that this could be because of rigid social norms. This could have been because of procrastination. It could have been because of poorly organized vaccination camps, or at the health centers, or it could have been all of the above. So I'll spend a minute and wait for your responses to come in. And then maybe at the end of a minute, you can launch the results of the poll. Okay, I think we can launch the results from whatever's in. Okay, interesting. So most of you say all of the above. And yes, that could be one of the cases, that it's a combination of all of these issues that are the problem. But if we just go back to the results from the baseline that was undertaken at the research study, which is again a trend that we see across the country as well, you will see that there's extremely high rates of early immunization. So for the BCG and Penta 1 and 2, there seem to be high rates of initial immunization, which really means that isn't a cultural resistance to immunization per se. There's no real social norm that's impeding parents actually getting their vaccinations. Similarly, we talked a little bit about what the steps the government has taken, and what policy efforts have been made to strengthen supply. So it's likely also that C is not really the option, where it's not really the issue of immunization camps per se, but most likely it's the issue of procrastination. And here what we mean by procrastination is that parents are most likely not really sort of able to grasp the immediate benefits of what might accrue to them from taking their children to an immunization camp or to the health center, and the costs that are faced in the present, which include potentially loss of wages, making the effort to travel, and loss of time as well, could be factors that make them procrastinate, which we also is also known as sort of present bias. So this is what the researchers really wanted to test, and understand whether it was this issue of procrastination, and whether therefore the small incentives could really offset this procrastination per se. So those of you who type B were most in line with the research study. I will move a little bit into then talking a little bit about the results from the study where the baseline was conducted, and I shared the findings of that with you. But essentially, then we this research which was undertaken in Haryana was to evaluate whether a combination of incentives, information, and social networks could boost this immunization, especially in the last two stages, for to ensure that you got fully immunized, every child got fully immunized. Previous research from this list of affiliates as well as others suggests that offering incentives, sending reminders, and using influential individuals in the community can build parental demand for vaccination and increase child immunizations. But what this study in particular was looking to do was to see whether this works, whether this is possible at scale. If you remember, the study in 2005, 2006 was conducted in one district. So, that was a much, much smaller scale study, whereas here you had this across 7 districts. And it was also looking at whether a combination of these incentives, of these interventions really worked better than these interventions in isolation, and what would be the most effective combination of these interventions to really understand for a policymaker's perspective what might be the most feasible to really scale. So the very end of each intervention was also tested to really try and understand whether incentives in general, or whether specific types of incentives, or whether social networks in general, or whether specific types of social networks made any impact on boosting that immunization demand. This study was held by again, the original research team was involved, so Professors Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, along with their team, and implemented in partnership with the National Health Mission, the government of Haryana. So, like I said, the idea was to test these solutions at scale to boost full immunization, and what they did was look at um, 3 demand generation strategies. The first was reminder text messages to parents, which may not be new to many of you who are in the field. But the second piece was to also sort of work with this, and as well as sharing information through social networks, and see whether the role of social networks in disseminating information and diffusing information in the local communities. And the third was to nudge caregivers in the form of non-cash incentives. In this case, it was mobile credit. Just a quick plug here that in the original study in 2005, you had dal and lentils, dal and a steel plate, sorry, that was given as an incentive. But when you think about what are the ways to scale interventions logistically, mobilizing something like that is not going to be feasible, especially for large scale deployment by the government. So we were looking at what is a non-cash incentive that is contemporary, but that still is meaningful to caregivers, and mobile credit was a great alternative that came up through focus group discussions that were conducted among the caregivers and their partners in Haryana. So this again used a randomized evaluation design to evaluate the impact of the program. And the idea was to do this across several districts with low immunization rates. So we had this intervention deployed in Bhiwani, Jajjar, Mewat, Palwal, Panipat, Rewari, and Sonipat. Just to quickly talk about what each of these interventions were. So the small incentives, were provided to caregivers every time they brought their child to a vaccination camp, and if they were in the treatment group where they received the incentives. The information through social networks was essentially where ambassadors that we identified were given information and asked to amplify information about immunization camps and what the benefits of immunization could be. And the text messages, quite simply, were to provide a reminder on the day or at a timely point to parents to let them know that an immunization was due for their child and when the next potential immunization camp was going to be held. I will now briefly talk a little bit about the research design. and sort of caveat that this research is in the process of being published. So there are certain details that may not be possible to share at this stage, but will be out very, very soon. So just a quick overview of the research design here. This was again conducted, like I said, in 7 districts and 140 primary health centers in Haryana across the 7 districts. Here, caregivers were either randomly selected to receive a small mobile credit each time they brought their children to get immunized. And within the PHCs, what researchers randomly did was to select sub-centers to receive varying levels of the incentives. So like I said at the beginning of this section, the idea was to understand what variants really work, not just whether the idea of incentives work, but what types of incentives work. So you can see that researchers randomized people to either caregivers to either get a high incentive at a flat rate. So either they all got 90 rupees for every immunization, or they got high incentives but in a sloped format. So they got 50 rupees for the first 3 interventions, for the first 3 immunizations, and then 100 and 200 rupees for the 4th and 5th one. So here you can see that there's a slope towards the latter half where immunizations anyway tend to dip. And similarly, they looked at whether it was a lower incentive amount could be given and whether that mattered or not in a similar format. The idea here was to again understand from a policymaker's perspective what would be most cost effective. And so if there was no difference between the high and the low incentive, perhaps we could then go with the low incentive. And of course, there was a comparison group that got no incentives at all. The next piece was the ambassadors experiment, right? And this was again layered onto the incentives intervention here, where what researchers wanted to study was what type of social networks really help in diffusing information. So the question that they wanted to answer was, does it matter whether you give information to a specific type of person, or could you just give it to anybody in the community, and will that message get diffused? And so you had villages were randomly assigned to one of 5 different ambassador selection strategies. The first is what we call the gossip seed. So here, what respondents were asked to do, and respondents here are the caregivers themselves, to identify who's the best at relaying information. And from where they get such information about local community events, what's happening on a day-to-day basis in their community, and who do they rely on for getting this information quickly and effectively. The second group of villages were assigned to understand the role of trusted seeds. So what we might typically think of trusted seeds as the village elders or the panchayat members or the local elected representatives. And here respondents were asked to sort of identify who they would generally trust to receive advice on health, on agriculture, on education, on government schemes, etc. The next sort of group of villages where the caregivers were asked to identify a combination of both. So who were both good at disseminating the information as well as who they trusted, to really try and understand whether it mattered, whether the person was both trustworthy and good at diffusing the information. The fourth group, of course, was just a random seed where, just random individuals from the community were selected to receive this information to see if it again mattered, whether your characteristics played a role in diffusing this information. And then, of course, there was the comparison group, which was the fifth group that did not receive this intervention at all. And of course, I'll come to the results in just a second, but I'll give you a minute to sort of absorb, the 2 layers of these interventions that took place. And again, happy to answer more detailed questions in the Q&A. The final piece, of course, was the SMS reminders that where caregivers were either randomly assigned to receive text messages and voice calls, reminding them that their child was due to receive a specific vaccine. So you had either the people receiving the reminders or not at all. And here the caregivers were randomized in such a way that either 33% of the caregivers in that community got the intervention, or 66% got the reminder intervention, or none of them got the intervention. The purpose of this was just to identify spillover effects, but we can come back to that in the Q&A if there's more questions about this. So just again to give you now a quick sort of glimpse at what the research design looked like, and to quickly recap that it looked at sort of incentives, information dissemination through ambassadors and what type of ambassadors, and text messages to caregivers as a reminder, for the immunizations. And the study findings were quite sort of interesting, because it highlighted that, unsurprisingly, that sloped incentives were effective, as well as the ambassadors. But which type of ambassadors is the interesting bit of insight that we get from the early results of the study. So when we talk about the incentives, they did have an overall positive impact on full immunization rates when administered based on an increasing schedule. So just to go back to that, the one where caregivers got 50 rupees for the first 3 immunizations, 100 for the fourth, and 200 for the fifth. That was the most promising and most impactful in achieving the full immunization. There was also positive and very significant effects in the ambassadors experiment. I apologize for that. When gossip seeds were the ambassadors. So again, I want to caveat here that the gossips were the ones that typically know all of the day-to-day information in the community. They may not be the village elders or the more trusted members of the community that typically health programmers have seen as a legitimate route to diffuse information. But what we find is, and this is consistent with earlier research again, on different in different sort of non-health settings, but speaking to the same idea that these kinds of gossips that we call sort of colloquially as ambassadors are the most effective at diffusing information. Unfortunately, the reminder messages on its own were disappointing, but again, this is consistent and it adds to the body of literature that we know where SMS reminders or voice reminders on their own may not be as impactful, but in combination with other interventions tend to have a very good impact. So among the packages here, there was a combination of like I said, the idea was to not just study what interventions work well, but what combination of these interventions really work, so that a policymaker can actually use these insights. And what we found was the combination of high sloped incentives, gossip ambassadors, and text reminders was the most effective and led to a nearly 45% increase in number of immunized children per village. Again, I haven't given you really the baseline statistics, but all of these details will be available in the working paper that should be out very soon. So this package was really the most impactful, in bridging that full immunization gap. And what we are now doing is sort of proposing 2 packages that may be possible to scale based on this finding that this combination of 3 interventions works. Again, this is keeping in mind, the policymakers' lens, where typically with immunization programs, what you need to do is, or any sort of health or social welfare programs, is to sort of try and identify what the most cost-effective solutions or interventions are, and try and understand what can be deployed at scale relatively easily. So the first package that we are proposing is this sort of opinion leader or gossip as ambassador, with layering it with the text messages, because the text messages are relatively costless, and when used in combination with the opinion leaders as ambassadors, actually lead to an increased vaccination coverage of about 25%. So that's fairly, and considering that there's potentially cost saving relative to the regular program. This is could be a sort of useful option for policymakers to consider depending on their local context, of course. The second package that again potentially policymakers can consider, and one that has a much more impactful sort of vaccination coverage, is the one we just talked about, which is opinion leaders as ambassadors, alongside text messages, along with the sloped incentives. So again, package two is essentially package one plus the sloped incentives, but we do know that it increases vaccination coverage by nearly half when the incentives are deployed. Now, there's obviously a question of how cost effective can incentives be, even if it's small mobile credits. Deploying them at scale can be a drain on the resources of the state. And so the one potential way to look at this is to think about maybe using incentives as a space to deliver these or to deploy them in low coverage areas, where immunization to begin with is already low, so you don't have high rates of initial immunizations either, and that can be a place where package two could be potentially deployed, even though it is more expensive per extra shot. While I haven't put this information on the screen, I do want to sort of share with you that what we found from package one is um, excluding the cost of the vaccines, it effectively costs less than $2.50 per additional fully immunized child when you use the first package of opinion leaders or gossips alongside the text messages. And most of the costs, when we had estimated them, 94% of the costs actually came from the cost of the extra vaccine itself. So just to drive home the point that this would be fairly cost effective to deploy by any government should they consider this kind of an intervention, depending on the problem that they are facing. The second package, again, excluding the cost of the additional vaccine and providing that vaccine itself, the cost drops. The cost is about $11.50 per additionally fully immunized child, which again may be slightly more expensive, but depending on the levels of immunization in the particular context, may actually make sense to deploy if you want to boost immunization as a whole. So I want to pause here before I move into the role of digital health systems and check on time. Shirley, could you let me know where we are at?
Yeah, we have about like 20 minutes left in the session.
Okay, great. So maybe I can spend 5 to 10 minutes talking a little bit about the role of digital health systems and how we envision, this set of interventions being deployed with the advances in technology and the kind of leaps and bounds that the government has invested, has made investments in as well. So, quick overview of how the TPK intervention was delivered. So, with this intervention, the incentives and the SMSs that I talked about, was delivered completely digitally. So, just to give you a quick overview, what happened was, at the site, ANMs collected data about the immunization, on a new e-health tablet that they were provided before the start of the intervention, of course, and they were trained on how to use this tablet and the application. But essentially, it was used to collect data about the child, essentially, what vaccination they were getting, what was the mobile number, if of the caregiver, so that the interventions could be deployed based on this information. And ANMs typically were expected to input this information on the field in real time. And because of the simplistic design of the app, through checks and interventions that we had done for the ANMs, we found that this was a fairly high rate of real-time delivery, real-time sort of data entry by the ANMs. But once the ANMs digitally entered this information, what happened was, the information was sort of received at the back end on the JPAL server, and the researchers used the receipt of whether they had which immunization or which vaccination they had just completed, to provide them the incentive if they belong to that treatment arm, and to make sure that the incentive was deployed almost immediately, so that the caregiver got the incentive at the almost at the site itself. And the delivery of this phone recharges was managed by the project team, of course, and again was delivered using an algorithm that was scripted on the server. So that's how this was an almost automatic process, and depending on, like I said, which shot you were getting, the incentive was deployed. The app also, what it did was, and just to close the loop on how that came about, essentially every time the child under the age of 12 was immunized, the form was uploaded to the server, and an automatic process was triggered where the JPAL server kind of sent a request to the server of the relevant mobile phone provider to provide this incentive recharge. So incentive mobile recharge. So this was nearly an automated process end to end. And the app also generated regular reports that the district immunization officers and the medical officers highlighted as being quite useful for monitoring purposes, and to identify gaps in coverage where ANMs, had the infrastructure in these 7 districts. And of course, there was several efforts made to train the ANMs to ensure that there was good quality data coming in. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if that, but in the interest of time, maybe I can, talk about what this means for how we are looking at now delivering such interventions digitally in the future. So one way is because of the promising results of the study. One way we're looking at it is to sort of deliver an implementation pilot with the same state government that we work with for the study, and to look at delivering all the 3 interventions digitally. I'll just pause here because what we did with the gossips intervention, or with the ambassadors intervention, was to collect that information through a door-to-door survey. But the idea is to try and use the existing health infrastructure, and to see whether the health infrastructure can support the identification of these community ambassadors, or these opinion leaders. One way is a relatively straightforward implementation through Unmol, which is ANM Online, or any other digital data collection system. For those who may not be aware, Unmol is a platform that the ANMs, that has been rolled out in most of the country, where ANMs are provided with a tablet that has an inbuilt system, where what was a very rigorous and a laborious sort of paper-based system has now been transported, or sort of transposed online completely. So given that the government has made these investments, and there is a sort of big push for Unmol adoption, this is one way of potentially recruiting the ambassadors, but also delivering the text messages as well as the incentives intervention. Again, to talk a little bit about how the nomination of opinion leaders can be potentially housed on this Unmol platform, it would be potentially through integrating a very simple questionnaire similar to what was done in the research study into the immunization script that they already have, and on the immunization module. It would take an additional bit of training alongside the existing training that already takes place for Unmol. What could be done is an add-on training just to help nurses on how to administer the questionnaire, which, like I said, was originally done through a door-to-door survey in the study. But in this case, we want to really try and digitize it and make it as seamless as possible. And what programmers would need to think about is how to contact the local change agents once we identify them, or the local gossips or the opinion leaders, because once we do have that information about who the most effective who sort of caregivers trust to be most effective at disseminating information, the question comes back to the program team as to how do we contact them, how do we loop them into and to seek their consent in terms of becoming the ambassadors, of course, which is an important part of the program. And we are planning to do this through JPAL's IDEA initiative, which is the initiative for innovations in data and experiments for action. So this is a sort of newly set up initiative by JPAL Global in 2018, and essentially is looking at sort of ways to make data providers, including governments, make their administrative data more accessible and usable. And by working with the government of Haryana on Anmol, what we are simultaneously looking to do is to help them strengthen their deployment of this digital platform, as well as concurrently, provide technical support for the implementation pilot, that is to identify the gossips, as well as deploy the incentives and the text messages through this integrated Anmol platform. So with this, I'm almost at the close. I will quickly summarize, and I think we can take a couple of questions. We started with, trying to understand the barriers to immunization, and identifying that it's not just strengthening supply, but there are interventions that are required for boosting immunization demand as well. And we talked about three sort of potential interventions that have been deployed most recently in Haryana, the non-cash incentives interventions, where we found that there's an overall positive impact, and it's more so when the incentives are sloped. That is, when they start with a steady number, a lower number, and increase with each successive immunization, particularly when the immunizations drop. We also talked about the social networks or the ambassadors intervention, which is very positive when the opinion leaders or the gossips are the ambassadors, and that's a little counterintuitive to I think what we have traditionally regarded as community ambassadors, such as religious leaders or community leaders, or elected officials in the community. The last bit is the text reminders intervention. This may not have been as promising in isolation, but could be a very useful combination along with other interventions, especially when you look at the cost effectiveness of deploying this. We also then talked about which kind of package is the most useful maybe for a policymaker to consider, and a combination of the high sloped incentives, opinion leaders, and text messages. While it shows the highest impact on full immunization, what is most cost effective may be the combination of the opinion leaders and the text messages. And finally, what we're now doing is piloting the program with the government of Haryana to see how this integrated to see if it's possible to integrate the delivery of these interventions through their digital health systems, which in the case of Haryana is the Anmol system. So I will pause here and maybe take a few questions. Shirley, if you can help me sift through some of them, that'd be great.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Anna. So we have a few questions, and they've been peppering through from different time points of the presentation. So the first one is from Annie. She's asking, I have a question on the 45% absenteeism report, and also on this poll question. So I guess, if you could explain a little bit more. I don't know if you know the specific slide, but I think somewhere you talked about a 45% absenteeism.
Yeah. Sure. So thanks so much, Shirley. So I think it's important to caveat that the absenteeism was very high in that particular district, and this was almost 15 years ago. So since then, the ANMs are far more, the supply side issues have been addressed, and we don't really have as high rates of absenteeism. But what it essentially meant was when the research team went out to kind of assess what the lay of the land was with regard to existing health infrastructure, in most cases, in almost half the cases, actually, they found that ANM simply weren't where they were supposed to be, which is at the health center. And they were certainly not there on the days where immunization sessions were expected expected to be held. So there was obviously a mismatch in their attendance as well as what was being communicated to the caregivers at that point of time. But again, that was only to anchor where some of the problems originated from, and to kind of also talk about the policy efforts that have been made since then to strengthen supply. So I think that's hopefully not as much of an issue anymore, but I hope that answers your question. I think the other question you had was on the poll.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah. There's not much more detail to this question, but maybe Ani, if you're still online, if you want to add it in, we can answer it later on.
Yeah.
The next question is on what does incentives with increasing schedule mean? Is it based on the severity of the disease?
Sure, I think that's a great question, and I mean, this has unpacked a fairly complex study. So let me spend a minute or two on that. Um, so if I look at the sort of incentives and the way they have been varied, it has to do not with the severity of the disease, but where the drop-offs are. So what the researchers wanted to test was whether giving a flat payment was the cinched it for the caregivers, or whether it mattered where increasing the incentive where the drop-offs were. So if you see the flat payment, the high incentives increasing payment essentially meant for the first three vaccinations, you got the same amount of money, that's 50 rupees. But for the fourth one, which is where if you remember the original slide, there's a significant drop off, you got 100 rupees. And for the fifth one, which was a even more significant drop off, you got 200 rupees. So the idea was to compensate you for and to increase the compensation where we knew the drop-offs are likely to happen. So I hope that answers the question.
Cool, thanks. And so just to link back to the poll question,
Yeah.
so it's specifically about how much is there a lack of awareness around immunization camps, awareness and knowledge about them? Is that to what extent is that a challenge?
So I would say it's lesser of a challenge today because I think the government has made efforts to incentivize health workers, including ashas, to enlist pregnant women and new mothers to attend immunization camps, and it's part of the larger RMNCHA program that the government of India has launched. So that is less of an issue because incentives have already been provided to the caregivers. But I think that was the question that the kind of question that was coming through.
Yeah, great, thanks. Next question is from Seema. Was the ambassador interventions targeted at the community level or the parent level, and how did they reach?
That's a great question. So the ambassador's intervention, like I said, was a survey. It was a door-to-door survey that was done with caregivers, and what it essentially did was ask the caregivers, who do you trust the most when you need information? And depending on the type of treatment arm, the kind of survey would have been different depending on what kind of seed they were trying to identify. But it was asked specifically to the caregivers to see who they trusted for different types of information that they typically look to the community for.
Thanks. Next question is, what approach was used to recruit the network seeds, and were there characteristics noticeable, like age, gender, literacy?
So that's a great question, and I think the kind of detail that you're looking for might be available in the working paper. So I'll urge you to maybe wait for that to make sure that the specifics of your question are answered. But I will say that with the network seeds, what we were looking for was people who either were great at diffusing the information or were trusted in the community, and that was essentially what we were trying to understand. Because I think the prevailing knowledge is that the typical leaders in the community are the ones that are good at diffusing information. But what we find from the study is that the diffusion of information, comes from more unlikelier sources, that is, more embedded individuals in the community.
The next question is just a clarification.
Sure.
Did everyone receive, so in this study, did everyone receive cash incentives except the control group?
So nobody received cash incentives. They were in the form of mobile credit. But yes, depending on which, except for the control group, depending on which arm you were, you either received a combination of the high incentives flat, high incentives increasing, low incentive flat, or low incentive increasing.
Great. Then we have a comment from someone, and they mentioned fieldwork comprises half of an A&M's workload. Is any opinions or any thoughts about that? I don't know if
Sorry,
the person.
could you repeat?
Yeah, it's a little short. I actually, the person who posted that, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more later on, and we'll jump to it.
Yeah.
Next. Okay, then Sentinel was asked what were challenges faced while doing the social network intervention?
I think again the challenges will be described in further detail in the in the paper. But I think the challenges that we are potentially going to face is what I can talk about, because what we're trying to do is transpose that door-to-door survey into a digital completely digital process, and to piggyback that onto an already maybe an already sort of strained healthcare system. So the way to do it, and the I think the challenges that we're trying to overcome are how do we do this in a way that makes it easy for the A&M to understand why we're deploying this intervention and what could be the potential benefits, not just to her, but to the community as well. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Sorry, just to do a quick time check. So we're at time, but there's
right.
still quite a lot of questions. Do you have a little bit more time, Anna, to go through them?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay, so one person has asked, is there any cost-benefit analysis or research regarding the digital platform piece of work that you were talking about?
Yes, and that will be discussed again in the paper. I'm not at liberty to share some of those findings right now. But the costs in the research study, the cost of designing the platform and providing the tablets was undertaken by the by the funding for the evaluation. But in the implementation pilot, this may not be as big of a cost center, because most state governments are already rolling out some kind of digital data collection systems. So it would be great to kind of work with the government and piggyback onto whatever infrastructure they have, and that's the idea, to make it really scalable.
Oh, okay. I don't know if we're going to have time for everyone's questions, but we can try to figure out the best way. There's a way that we can get.
Sure. I mean, I'm also happy to answer them over email, and have people email them to me as well. So in case there's more questions about that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I think I'm just trying to see which ones we can ask next. I think. Let's see. Okay, we'll take maybe like.
Also, let me help you and have a quick
look. Yeah, I think we'll do about 3 more questions. So one person has asked a little bit more detail around the SMS reminder. So specifically asking why were there 33% and 66% reminders for the SMS, and how was the distribution decided upon, and what basis?
That's a really great question. So I can answer this very briefly, and again, more details will be in the paper. But essentially, we looked at trying to understand what kind of saturation is required for the message to really be driven home, but to also measure spillover effects. So that's why there was a variation of 0, 33, and 66% among those who got the reminders, to see at the subcenter level if there was the individuals were talking about it within the community, and so we would be able to assess between the groups that got 33% and 66%. It's obviously a simple answer to a like slightly more complicated question, but again, the paper will have more details for you.
Awesome, thanks. And the next question is on, so for the social network component, what did those community ambassadors communicate about the vaccine in particular?
Right. So they were asked to communicate if they belong to also because this was cross randomized, if they belong to an incentive cluster as well. What they were asked to communicate was information about the incentives, but information about when the immunization camps were going to be held or what the immunization day was at the particular health center, as well as just reiterate the benefits of immunization and talk about that within their community. So that was the information that they were expected to share. And of course, this information was relayed to them on message and on voice reminders as well.
Great. Sorry, I know I keep saying the last two questions, but I feel like it's helpful to ask them. Okay, so next.
These are great questions. No, thank you so much. And I'm sorry I'm not doing I'm not able to do full justice because the paper will be out very soon. So
yeah, it's exciting. It leaves us with a cliffhanger. Okay, the next two questions are from Pooja. I'm just going to read them both out. So her first question is on, did provision of incentives also include spreading a message to caregivers that incentives will be provided to them, or was the expectation that knowledge on incentives would spread automatically? And then the second is, what kind of messages were sent as reminder messages? And she caveat that the detail may not be able to be shared now, but she wanted to understand if the reminder messages were personalized to the schedule for the child.
Yes, absolutely. They were, and because this data was all being tracked on the tablet and on the server, you were able to use the algorithm to automate the message that was going to the caregiver and make sure that it had either the caregiver's name or the child's name, what immunization was missed, and what immunization, if they had missed an immunization, for instance, and what immunization was due next, along with details of when the immunization camp was next going to be held. I missed the first part of the question.
Yeah. The first question was, did the provision of incentives also include spreading a message to caregivers that incentives will be provided to them?
Yes. This was done. This obviously was only in the PHCs that were randomized to receive the incentives, and there were posters put up. You also had so to ensure transparency, as well as you had the gossips reminding them in cases where both of them belong to the same primary health center.
Great. Okay, and then the last question we have, which is a good way to round us out, because we're, I'm sure, all thinking about COVID all the time. Do you foresee challenges with convincing people to get the COVID vaccine? Is the government planning on coupling other immunizations at the time people seek out this immunization?
Good questions. I don't know if I can answer them fully, but I think the challenges with convincing people to get the COVID vaccine may not be as as there might not be as much resistance, because what we've seen from this research is that there is generally an acceptance for immunizations as long as there's no inconvenience to the individual for getting the immunization. So the first shot, which was almost at 100%, if you remember, is given to you at the time of birth. So that's typically why there is high rate there, and there is no resistance clearly. So I don't. Personally, I don't foresee that there may be in the Indian context as many challenges as maybe in other parts of the world where there's a stronger anti-vaxxer movement and stuff like that. And on the government plans, I mean, I really wouldn't be able to comment at this stage, but typically it would sort of rely on using the existing health infrastructure and trying to piggyback onto that. So I imagine that they might use all of the gains that have been made from the massive investments in health so far, including your VHSND days, your dedicated immunization camp days, etc., to make sure people are getting the vaccine and on time, and depending on these specific user groups. So
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. And thanks so much, Anna, for presenting a great body of work.